He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 20 years of experience. I've made you a lot younger than you really are, Henry's. You're welcome. And together,
Thank you.
Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, today we're going to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while. I don't get the question a lot in my training, my workshops, but I do get it occasionally. And it's a combination of things that have come together like a perfect storm. The question I want to ask, and the framing of the question that I want to ask, that I want us to talk about, is why do creative briefs rarely, if ever, have a question that asks, what is the strategy? And before we dive into answering the question, the reason I want to discuss this is because in light of Peter Paul Von Wheeler and Matt Davies' wonderful, insightful survey from now, 2-3 years ago, which revealed many things, one of which was that 60% of marketers admitted to using the creative process to figure out the strategy, which clearly says that there was no understanding of strategy before they began. Second, that you and I think, agree that it's pretty darn hard to write a brief if you don't know what the strategy is. And third, when I asked the question a number of years ago in a training among those who were sitting there, what is your definition of a creative brief? The answer I got from a marketer in this particular setting has stuck with me forever. And I use it now in my training because it was, to me, so spot on. And he said, and this is a marketer who answered the question, said, a creative brief is the emotional translation of the strategy. I thought, wow, I like that a lot. So you bring all these disparate points together that I've been thinking about, that have been dancing around in my head, to this question: why do so few briefs? I mean, we've looked at a number of great briefs over the last many months. You know, the Kiwi brief for TRG, a Dodge brief. We've looked at some of your briefs, the Hulu brief. We've looked at a bunch, and they don't ask the question, what is the strategy? Why do you suppose that is, Henry? What are your thoughts on that? I've got some thoughts, but I want to throw it to you first because you are the guy who writes the brief.
So first, I think it's important to define terms. And it sounds like semantics, but defining terms is important. And a lot of words like insight, the word strategy gets thrown around a lot and it's conflated with a lot of other things. In a way, a creative brief for a creative assignment is a strategy document. It's a document that directs the creatives, that says, if we can convince consumers of this thing, or if we can do this, if we can instill this behavior change, then we win. And so that's a strategy document, but it's a narrow strategy document because it's for a specific assignment. Then there's brand strategy, which is what are the strategic choices that we've made that we think are going to help us win as a brand. And so that is basically, who are we competing with? On what grounds are we competing with them? Are we competing with them based on price, based on quality, based on newness, based on whatever it is? So those are strategic decisions that are made upstream of a creative brief. And then there's a business strategy that occurs upstream of the brand strategy, right? Like, so there's a company kind of like, at a company level, there has to be some sort of strategy. And, we were talking offline, like Tesla made a series of strategic choices made based on the theory of how they would win in the very competitive, very crowded automotive space. And so that's strategy, and strategy is different than a plan. I saw a really good Harvard Business Review video that in like a few minutes summarizes what's the difference, because planning and strategy get conflated all the time. And strategy is those series of choices based on a theory to win, or a game theory to win, that you make. And then the plan is basically, what are the steps we need to carry out to to make that come to life. And his argument is that too many people in companies, right, decision makers, spend too much time making plans rather than coming up with the correct strategy, because it's very comforting to have a plan to say we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing, and to put up a flip chart of all the different things that you're doing, as opposed to talk conceptually about how we're going to win is by depositioning the competition, by creating a new product that's innovative, by getting rid of the dealer model, like whatever that those things are that are those strategic choices. So the question is, how much strategy should there be on a brief? And my answer is the brief is in itself a strategic document. Then the question is, how much of the brand strategy should be in the creative brief?
And that's what I think. That's what I think is what we're aiming at here. It's not the business strategy, it's the brand strategy.
So there should be enough of the brand strategy in the brief so that there's no doubt about what the brand strategy is. How explicit you have to be is it's not necessarily it's not it's not a thing that's written in stone, right? Like if you're working with a team that is very familiar with the ethos of the brand and the strategy and what all the communications are supposed to do, right? Very powerful, strong brand, then it might be a little redundant to go too in depth on that on a brief. If you're working on a client you've never worked on before or on a pitch, it's worth explaining at least to the level that you can explain based on what the potential client has given you and based on what you know from the real world and from observing the brand, what the brand strategy is, and create some sort of proxy for that within your brief so that people understand, like, the reason that Geico does this type of humor is because they're trying to do this strategically as a brand.
Well, let's take a look at example. I mean, I've talked about the Kiwi brief a lot. I love the brief, and we had the joy of meeting the author of that brief, Sarah Walker Hall. And one of the things that I learned when I had that conversation with her is that she was part of the team that pitched that account and stole it. I don't know the agency that had been working on Kiwi prior to TRG, but she was part of the team that put together whatever the strategy was to create a winning pitch, and they won the business. That brief for that particular campaign was not only her first brief, but it was the kickoff brief once they'd won the business. There's no strategy statement of any kind in that
well,
brief.
that gets at something that we also spoke about. It's funny, we could record whole episodes before we start recording, but
which
uh,
we should do.
but to your original point of using the creative process to figure out what the strategy is, that happens a lot in pitches, right? Like basically what the client is saying is, here's everything we have, make something coherent of this. And so they give you an assignment. They say, come up with a campaign with TV, with radio, with a billboard, and here's a bunch of materials. And it's up to you to make something of it, to make a coherent story, to create a brand strategy. They never asked for a brand strategy, but in order to make a coherent campaign, right, that you can sell them on, it has to make sense somehow to them. So in a lot of ways, clients that are unsophisticated or that are in this kind of, the reason they're having a review is because what they're doing isn't working and they need to try something new in hopes that it'll work, is they're abdicating basically that brand planning work that really the client should be doing, could be in conjunction with the agency, and the agency should be getting paid a hefty fee for that, but they disguise it in the form of a tactical brief for a pitch, and then you have to do that big picture thinking anyway. So they're getting all that stuff for free, essentially, in a pitch. And by the way, the dirty little secret is that all agencies have kind of accepted this as the current state of affairs. And so we do all this brand planning work as a appetizer to show them, okay, and here's the assignment you gave us, and here's why we chose to use, a gecko, and why we chose to do this and do that is because we created this brand strategy based on all the garbage that you gave us at the beginning of this assignment.
Yeah, and my comment about the Kiwi brief is in no way a slam, against Sarah or TRG for not having a clear strategy statement on the document itself. Because for one, as you've just pointed out, you know, this is kind of the way of the world. But the other truth of the matter might be it was talked out during the briefing. There might have been a separate document, a separate exercise of some kind that articulated what this strategy was going to be and didn't need to be part of the document because it's still I agree that there's a strategic nature to the brief, but it's a tactical document. This is like, do this. This is what we
So
want you to think.
yeah.
Yeah, well, so in essence, the template itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to requiring that kind of statement.
Yeah.
But when I see these elements that marketers are not familiar with what a strategy is, and they're using the process of seeing the creative come together to help them figure out what the strategy is, combined with what we know is a dearth of training, not just in creatives, but in marketing, especially in marketing. And then the belief that you can't really write a brief without a strategy statement. It just behooves the question. It seems to me to make the question obvious. We should have another box on the brief that says, articulate that statement somewhere, so we're all on the same page. If for no other reason, we're all on the same page.
So one of my early mentors in advertising was a woman who had headed up a Y&R office prior to her joining the agency where I later joined her at. So she was trained during a period of time, by the way, where there was a lot more training. And she provided me with a folder that had 4 documents in them. And one of the documents was the creative brief template that they had used previously at Y&R, Young and Rubicam. And but there were other templates in there, and one of them was for a brand brief, basically a brand strategy document, like in the similar format to a creative brief, like a series of questions and answers that would get you to what that brand strategy was. And by necessity, they're sequential. You need to know what the brand strategy is before you could come up with a creative brief for an assignment. And again, based on the lack of training that there is out there, the amount of people that are just winging it and faking it till they make it, these things aren't necessarily self-evident that you need to have a brand plan or a brand foundation before you get to a creative brief. And like I said, a lot of times in the heat of battle, you have to invent that brand strategy or a proxy for that brand strategy in order for the creative brief to make any sense to any sort of like existing reality in the world. So a very perceptive creative brief writer will have to fill in those gaps and kind of create that brand plan, even if they were never given an official document. The truth is, most clients fall into 2 categories. Client brands. They fall into the category of they've never done the work of really defining what their brand strategy is. Or 2, somebody did some work a long time ago and nobody remembers what it is. But certainly very few brands have done the work, identified a unique brand strategy that everybody within the organization that needs to know it knows it, and that everybody's executing from. That is like rare air in the business. And you would think it would be a pretty basic requirement is, what's this brand mean? What's it stand for? What are we trying to do with the brand? And then, okay, now I know what we need to do with the advertising.
Well, if you're Bob Hoffman, the answer is 3 words. Make us famous. Let's go home.
Yeah, that's not a, again, we've had that conversation a bunch of times. That's not a strategy.
No,
A
it's not a brief either.
a
Not a brief
strategy,
either.
yeah, a strategy, as I've said, is a series of decisions of what battlefield are we going to play on? what weapons are we going to use? We talked a little bit again off the air about like SWOT analysis, right? Like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And there's a lot of people that rightly think this is a antiquated way of thinking about things, but in reality, it's a good exercise that makes you think about um, what your what's internal to the brand, your strengths and weaknesses, right? Like realistically, to your point off the air, and what are the opportunities and threats that exist in the environment that are out there in the culture, in the market, in the world that could affect our business and what we're trying to do. And I mentioned a great example of like a difference between opportunities and threats and strengths and weaknesses is Blockbuster Video, which we all know is a defunct video rental retailer that
Brick and
had
mortar.
thousands of stores around the country, and now they're extinct. They don't exist anymore. And this, the easy answer is they got out innovated. But the reality is, if somebody had been thinking about strategy, they didn't have to be out innovated because Netflix is still around. And even though Netflix was something different than Blockbuster, it also required physical DVDs to use Netflix initially. And so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they would drop their business model and move to streaming. But they did, and that's why they're still around and they're one of the biggest streamers out there. Whereas Blockbuster has said, well, we have strength. We have all these retail stores. We have good customer service. We have a great assortment of movies. We have this and that. But in the end, the threats from outside of the company completely overwhelmed any strengths that they might have. Their weaknesses ended up being the lack of imagination of where technology was going, where entertainment was going. So I think whether you use a SWOT or not, there has to be somebody who's having these making these strategic decisions, ideally, to your point, always collaborating with the smart people in the company to come up with, okay, here's what our business strategy is, here's what the brand strategy is, and then we can have that more tactical, creative brief, which is an element of strategy.
Well, I guess what it comes down to is my favorite definition of a creative brief, which I articulated earlier in our conversation, spoken by a marketer, which is the emotional translation of the strategy is very pretty. But I don't know
Yeah,
if it has much substance to it. If we can't even
I'll
agree on what the strategy is.
I'll buy it. I mean, I think strategy is by definition something clinical. It's a
Okay, yeah.
it's a you know using the chess analogy, right? It's I'm going to use the queen's gambit to capture this piece that's going to open up the rest of the board for me. That's very clinical. Advertising doesn't work that way. We're dealing in the world of convincing people to change behaviors, to change buying preferences that might be deeply seated. And so we're dealing in the world of human psychology and emotions. So and the people that have to come up with the advertising are emotional beings themselves. So we have to somehow move them. That's where the inspiration part of the brief comes from, right? Is to try to get them to feel um, what we want them to feel so that they can make consumers feel that.
Well, I guess I could say that this is a conversation where we will have more to come. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye bye.